Hello and welcome to our video on exposure for video. I call this the pathway of light to adjusting exposure for video in a live setting. So this is for multiple cameras to be able to equalize the exposure so that we can switch from one camera to another, that they're exposed right. First of all, if you have the opportunity, grab this sheet from me, and I'll be doing another video following up where we get hands-on with our specific camera models that we have. So this is more universal, like if you want to know just the basics of it and what are our options as far as changing our exposure. So first of all is our scene illumination. This is our lighting guy sets this. Now the upside of this, or where we want to use this, is if all our cameras are all set the same and we have the same exposure but they're all a little too dark or they're all a little too light, or if certain areas of our stage might be too light or dark. So this also affects the live room as well. So we don't necessarily, like if we're all dark, we don't necessarily say we need more light for our cameras if the scene for the people in the room is right. If there's the right amount of light in the room and it can't go up anymore or down anymore without ruining the look in the room, then we move on to our next step of where we can control things from the camera. So beyond scene illumination, our first one that we'll look at is iris or aperture. So we have our video terms and our photography terms, and a lot of photography terms are also used in video now as well. So the video term was iris, but we also have aperture as well, and this is right on the lens, and a lot of times we will share lenses between photography and video as well. So this is basically constricting the lens to let in less or more light. And this is where we hear the term f-stops. So we have an f number that will appear either on the lens itself, or if the lens is built into the camera, then it will be referred to in our display. We'll see an f number on our camcorders. So here's an example from a photography lens. This is an f1.4 lens, so that the lower the f number, the wider it'll open. So if you have an f1.4, it actually has a pretty big opening. So here's f1.4, and as you can see, as I click it down, I'm going to a higher f number, and I don't know if you can see that, but the hole in the middle is getting smaller. So all the way down to f16 is what this lens will go down to. So f16 all the way up to f1.4, and we have this. And we need bigger lenses and bigger glass in order to open up to a wider aperture, which means a lower f number. Now, what this affects is as it opens up further, it lets in more light, so that will give us a higher exposure. What it also affects is, whether you consider this good or bad, is our depth of field. So as we open up our aperture wider, our depth of field gets narrower, so the amount of things that are in focus. So for example, right now I'm shooting this video on a full frame camera, so a bigger sensor, which maximizes that shallow depth of field, but I have to shoot it at about I'm shooting about f5 right now, just so that as I move around, I'm not going too far out of focus. Now I might not be exactly in focus right now, but as I go backwards, you might see me kind of leave and get more blurry. If I go forward, maybe I'm going a bit more blurry. So I'm trying to create a bit of a safe area with a deeper depth of field by stopping down to a higher number of about f5. It's kind of middle of the road. Whereas if I did f1.4, I would have to be super still. I wouldn't be able to move. I'd have to nail it and then just never move at all in order to be in focus. Otherwise, it'd be driving you nuts how blurry I was the whole time. So this is something that's controlled typically on the lens. For most of our cameras, we controlled on the lens. Our camcorders, we'll unpack how to do these on each of them, but sometimes it's controlled from the camera as well. But it's typically in little stops. Sometimes it can be, certain lenses will give you a clickless aperture, it's called, and some will click as you go down, and it might be at a half a stop or a whole stop that they click at. So that's one way, and to reduce the amount of light if you need to. Typically we're going pretty wide because we're indoors and we're trying to maximize the amount of light and get a cleaner image later on. So a lot of times we're shooting wide open or closer to wide open. Some lenses will get a lot sharper as you stop down a little bit, and that starts to get worse if you stop down way too much, but generally we're going pretty close to wide open so that we can have a shallower depth of field, isolate our subject a lot more. So we can, by focusing, we can tell the viewer what they ought to be looking at that moment. And so we can kind of shape our story that way by creating a shallower depth of field. Look at this right now. Now maybe look over there. So we might have something focus from something in the foreground to something in the background. You see this in movies all the time, and they do it very, very precisely. We're in a live setting, so it'll be a little bit more rough, but as smoothly as we can do that, we will, and this is where we call, we rack our focus. We can really take advantage of focus racking, going from something in the foreground to background or vice versa, and really isolating that subject is something that you really can only do if you have a wider aperture and a shallower depth of field to work with. Some of our previous camcorders, they had pretty small sensors, so even at a they opened up to maybe an f1.8 or something, or f1.4. But that f1.4 on a smaller sensor basically gives you a much deeper depth of field. So it seemed like everything was in focus all the time. Anyway, so as you open up, you get a shallower depth of field, but you also let in more light. So that's the trade-offs. We are exchanging a creative element to reduce the light and make it a deeper focus. Now we may want to show more than one thing in focus. Usually for us, indoors, on stage, where we don't have tons and tons of extra light to work with, we're most often going to be going pretty shallow, just because we need that light. So again, that's the iris or the aperture. Iris is what you'll see on some of the camcorders. That's what they'll refer to it as. So just know it's the same thing. Iris and aperture are that basically what your eye is doing, the iris of your eye, closing down the hole and opening it up again. ND filters are the next thing that we're going to talk about. And this is a tough one because every camera system might be different on how they have ND filters, if they have them at all. Like some of our cameras won't even have that option. I don't have it built into my own personal camera, but I have this adapter that goes behind the lens, between the lens and the camera, that allows me to have a variable ND filter within it. And so think of ND filters. So this is a way to also, typically we just use it to get things darker. It's like sunglasses for your camera. And now, and it doesn't really affect anything else creatively except for bringing the light down. So that's a really useful thing, especially if you need to go outdoors where there's tons of light. You basically, in video, you need ND filters because otherwise you're sacrificing some other aspects that you probably really don't want to sacrifice. And that's basically how you get video on phones that never looks like good video, because without ND filters, they're having to do a lot of other things. Usually it's cranking the shutter speed, which we'll talk about a bit later. But my camera uses a variable ND. So it's basically just a couple polar kind of lenses, or polar sunglasses, or polarized lenses, I guess. And as you turn them in relation to each other, you can see that it gets darker and darker. Now this is variable, so there's no actual specific stops happening. It's not like switching sunglasses, which is what happens on our one of our cameras here. This is one of our new cameras called the EVA 1, and it has an ND filters right after the lens. So I just took the lens off, and right on that front part there, and you can go. It starts with basically no ND filter on, and it has a few steps, and it'll just basically slide a pair of sunglasses in front, but doesn't affect the depth of field, doesn't change our amount of motion blur or anything like that. So ND filters are like the perfect way in video to get rid of light. The next thing is in video we call it the shutter angle, and in photography we call it the shutter speed. And sometimes even in video we use shutter speed as well. But nicer cameras will typically allow you to do a shutter angle, because 180-degree shutter angle, basically it being open for half the time that you have a frame in front of you, will give you the right amount of motion blur that feels very natural. So now that is typically, if you don't have the option of shutter angle and setting it to 180 degrees, and that's what we'll be working with pretty much all the time, then we have to go with the shutter speed. Then we have to know our frame rate and double it and figure out that shutter speed there. So it's like, so if we are shooting at say 4K and we're at a frame rate of 24 frames per second, then we need to go, okay, double 24, so only half the time that we are on that frame is a 48th of a second. So we have a 48th of a second shutter speed. Or if we have the option of only 50, then that's close enough. Like, we would never be able to tell the difference. So then if we were shooting at, say, 30p, 1080p 30, something like that, then we'd want to set it at 60, a 60th of a second shutter speed. What's nice is if we were switching between frame rates and we have the option of a shutter angle, keeping it at 180 degrees, the camera will automatically figure that out for you. So it kind of saves a step there. Now, this really affects motion blur. So we could use it creatively. If we wanted to have this, if you're trying to create a scene, typically live we wouldn't do this, but if you want to create a scene or do some sort of crazy look from one camera where there's like tons of motion blur, then you might open it up even more and slow down your shutter speed. Or you could crank it up even faster, and then things can sometimes look a lot choppier, right? So right now I'm at a 180 degree shutter angle. And so as I wave my hand, you will see noticeable motion blur, but it's in a natural way. The reason why we need to know it is not necessarily to let in more or less light, but know that it will affect it and make sure it's at 180 degrees, basically. So if we're shooting at 24p, make sure that you see that it's at a 48th of a second, or that your camera, if it's showing in a shutter angle, that you see the little words that say 180 degrees on it. So basically we don't want it to change. We want all the cameras to have a similar look and have the same shutter speed and a natural amount of motion blur. Because we typically are shooting indoors in our live setting, we're not using ND filters, and because we don't want to change our amount of motion blur and make things look like incohesive, we want to make sure that our shutter angles is always the same. So basically the two things that we're looking at the most are going to be our iris and our gain. And typically we want our iris or aperture to be pretty close to wide open, depending on whether we want a shallower or we need to make it a little bit deeper, just because it's just so hard to keep something in focus. So then basically the gain is the one thing that we're left with. So between the iris and the gain, or the other term that's used in photography is ISO. Even in video we're using the term ISO or ISO values a lot. And so this is where we typically will fine-tune our ISO just to get our exposure just right. Because we might have already chosen a certain amount of depth of field that we want based on the iris, that our only creative or only kind of like non-creative method to adjust our exposure will be our ISO. And so it's also on some cameras will be the decibel. It'll say like 3 decibels, 6 decibels. Usually it's in increments of 3 on certain cameras. And in ISOs, it's typically, you know, anywhere from, we're usually ranging from maybe 100 up to I don't know, maybe 2500. We don't typically try not to go too high, because the trade-off of this as we crank our gain is that we get a noisier and noisier image. We start to lose our dynamic range. Everything starts to, like the amount of difference between our darks and our lights start to get lost. Everything kind of just like looks in the middle and very flat and blah. This is mostly, I mean, there's been a lot of advances in recent years as far as getting better low light, better gain out of these cameras without sacrificing all this dynamic range and without getting too much noise. And so we have a lot more versatility this way nowadays. But if you notice a super grainy image, that's probably because your gain has been cranked too high. And it's probably, and if it's cranked so high but you're not like crazy overexposed, then probably what the problem is you've probably either put an ND filter on and not realized it, or you've stopped down your aperture too tight, or you've cranked your shutter angle or your shutter speed up too high to be like too fast. So that's the story. Like, that's the pathway of light. We go from our scene through our lens and our aperture and how much light we let through there. And then we have our ND filters, and whether we have some on or not, that are kind of like taking away some of that light. And then we have our shutter speed, how much that kind of it opens up for each frame, how long it's exposing it for, and then our actual sensor gain. In the future video, and we're going to show you how to do it on each of our cameras, just so you have a reference point. Yeah, so thanks for watching, and feel free to ask questions, and grab my little cheat sheet that I've made as well. Maybe it'll give you some visual reminders on how on what these options are. Thanks.